He believed humiliating one quiet tenant would remind everyone who held the power. But before the sun set over Maple Grove Apartments, one simple act of honesty would begin tearing down everything his pride had built. The crisp October air drifted through the courtyard as residents carried grocery bags and hurried toward the brick apartment buildings before the evening chill settled in. Children laughed near the small playground while elderly neighbors exchanged friendly waves from weathered benches. It looked like any ordinary Tuesday in a quiet American town until the polished black SUV rolled slowly through the entrance and stopped beside the leasing office. Victor Harrington stepped out wearing an expensive charcoal overcoat, polished leather shoes, and the unmistakable confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. As the owner of Maple Grove Apartments, he enjoyed making surprise visits because he believed fear kept people respectful. Employees straightened their posture the moment they saw him, and conversations faded into uncomfortable silence. Victor scanned the property with narrowed eyes before his attention settled on a young woman carrying 2 reusable grocery bags toward Building C. Emily Carter wore faded blue jeans, clean white sneakers, and a light gray sweater that had clearly been mended more than once. A loose strand of blonde hair slipped across her face as she balanced the bags carefully, trying not to crush the carton of eggs resting on top. She moved with quiet determination, never asking anyone for sympathy despite working long hours and stretching every dollar to care for her aging mother. To Victor, however, none of that mattered. All he noticed was another tenant whose rent payment had arrived later than usual. Emily Carter, he called loudly enough for half the courtyard to hear. She stopped immediately, turned toward him, and offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrington." Her calm voice irritated him even more. "Good afternoon," he repeated with a cold laugh. "I suppose it is a good afternoon when someone else pays the bills." Several residents slowed their steps, pretending to check their mail while quietly watching. Emily lowered her eyes for only a moment before meeting his gaze again. "My payment will be complete on Friday, just as I explained to the office." Victor folded his arms. People always have explanations. Responsible people have money. A few nervous chuckles escaped from nearby onlookers, though most remained uncomfortably silent. Emily tightened her grip on the grocery bags, but refused to argue. Victor took another step closer, making sure everyone could hear every word. Maybe this community has become too generous. Perhaps it's time to remind people that apartments like these aren't charity. His property manager shifted uneasily, but said nothing. Emily inhaled slowly, her blue eyes steady despite the embarrassment spreading across her face. "I'm doing everything I can," she answered softly. "Sometimes that's not enough," Victor replied. "People either belong here or they don't." The courtyard fell completely silent. Even the children seemed to stop playing for a heartbeat. Victor believed he had just taught another struggling tenant an unforgettable lesson. What he failed to notice was the worn brown leather briefcase resting beside the rear tire of his own SUV, accidentally left behind after an important meeting containing documents that could decide the future of everything he owned. Emily noticed it immediately as Victor turned away, but instead of calling out, she simply looked at the forgotten case with quiet eyes, unaware that the next decision she made would forever change both of their lives. Emily stood motionless for a few seconds after Victor disappeared into the leasing office, her fingers still wrapped around the grocery bags while the forgotten leather briefcase rested only a few feet away beside the rear wheel of the black sport utility vehicle. Around her, whispers drifted through the courtyard like leaves carried by the autumn breeze. Some neighbors shook their heads with sympathy while others quietly returned to their apartments, relieved that they had not become the target of Victor Harrington's public criticism. Emily simply bent down, picked up the briefcase with both hands, and carried it inside her apartment without opening it. She carefully placed it on the small kitchen table beside a vase filled with fresh wildflowers that she had gathered during her morning walk. Her apartment reflected the same quiet simplicity that defined her life. The furniture was clean but well used. Family photographs filled the walls instead of expensive decorations. A handwritten calendar covered with work schedules, medical appointments, and monthly expenses hung beside the refrigerator. Every dollar had a purpose. Every hour had a responsibility. Emily placed the groceries into the cabinets before preparing a warm bowl of chicken soup for her mother, Helen, whose health had declined during the past year. Helen smiled gently as Emily carried the tray into the bedroom. "Long day?" she asked softly. Emily returned the smile without mentioning the humiliation outside. "Just another busy afternoon." She had learned years earlier that protecting someone you loved sometimes meant carrying your own burdens quietly. After helping her mother with dinner and medication, Emily returned to the kitchen. Her eyes settled once again on the briefcase. It was clearly expensive, the kind that belonged in executive boardrooms instead of modest apartments like hers. Anyone struggling financially might have been tempted to discover what was inside, especially after being embarrassed in front of an entire community only minutes earlier. Emily never reached for the locks. Instead, she searched for a business card or identification attached to the outside, but found nothing. She folded her hands together and looked through the apartment window toward the leasing office where the lights were still glowing against the darkening sky. Somewhere inside that building, Victor Harrington probably had not even realized what he had lost. Across the courtyard, the property manager suddenly hurried outside, speaking anxiously into a cellular phone while another employee searched the parking lot with growing panic. Even from her window, Emily could recognize the difference between ordinary concern and genuine fear. Something about that briefcase mattered far more than anyone had expected. She quietly put on her light jacket, lifted the case from the table, and stepped back into the cool evening air. Several neighbors noticed her carrying it and exchanged curious glances, but Emily kept walking toward the leasing office with calm, steady steps. She did not expect gratitude. She certainly did not expect an apology. She simply believed that honesty was not supposed to depend on how someone treated you. As the office door came into view, she could already hear raised voices inside, each one more anxious than the last, while the worn leather handle rested firmly in her hand like a silent test that only character, not circumstance, could truly answer. Emily pushed open the glass door to the leasing office just as another employee rushed past her toward the parking lot, his face pale with worry. The usually polished reception area felt completely different now. Telephones rang without pause. Filing cabinets stood open. Papers covered the front desk, and every conversation carried the same nervous urgency. Victor Harrington stood near his office with his overcoat removed, speaking sharply into his cellular phone while two managers searched every corner of the room. The confidence that had filled the courtyard only minutes earlier had begun to crack beneath visible frustration. One employee noticed Emily first and pointed toward the leather briefcase in her hands. The room instantly fell silent. Victor turned around so quickly that his expression froze the moment he recognized the worn brown case. He crossed the room in long, hurried steps before stopping only a few feet away from her. His eyes remained fixed on the briefcase, as though he could hardly believe it still existed. Emily extended it toward him without saying a word. "I found it beside your vehicle," she said calmly. "I thought you would want it back." Victor accepted the briefcase almost mechanically and immediately checked the brass locks before opening it just enough to glance inside. His shoulders relaxed with visible relief. Every folder appeared untouched. Every document remained exactly where he had left it. The room released a collective breath. One assistant quietly whispered, "Thank goodness," while another lowered his head in disbelief. Emily waited politely, expecting nothing more than confirmation that everything was there. Instead, Victor closed the briefcase and looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. For the first time that day, he was speechless. The silence lasted only a few seconds before one of the senior managers spoke carefully. "Sir, those are the partnership agreements for tomorrow morning. Without them, the financing meeting would have been canceled." Another employee added, "There are signed property contracts in there that cannot be replaced." Emily had not known any of that. To her, it had simply been something that belonged to another person. Victor cleared his throat and adjusted his grip on the briefcase. "Did you open it?" he asked. Emily gently shook her head. "No." He studied her face, almost expecting hesitation or uncertainty, but found neither. "You never looked inside," he repeated. "It was not mine," she answered simply. The words lingered in the office with surprising weight. Several employees exchanged quiet glances because they knew exactly how much temptation that briefcase represented. Victor himself understood even better. He slowly nodded, though the pride that usually shaped his posture prevented any deeper acknowledgement. "Very well," he said in a measured voice. "You may go." There was no thank you. No apology for what had happened outside. No recognition of the integrity she had just demonstrated. Emily smiled politely anyway. "I hope everything works out tomorrow," she said before turning toward the door. As she stepped back into the cool evening air, she believed the matter had ended. Behind her, however, one elderly maintenance supervisor quietly watched through the office window and murmured almost to himself, "Some people spend a lifetime trying to buy the kind of character that young woman carries for free." Victor heard every word, but instead of responding, he tightened his grip on the recovered briefcase, unaware that the greatest danger to his company had never been losing it in the parking lot. It had already found its way into the conference room waiting for him the following morning. The next morning arrived. Wrapped in cold gray clouds that hung low over the city, casting long shadows across the glass towers downtown where Victor Harrington's most important business meeting of the year was about to begin. The conference room on the 23rd floor reflected everything he valued. Polished walnut walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive leather chairs, and a long table prepared with neatly arranged contracts waiting for signatures. Senior executives, attorneys, financial advisors, and investment partners exchanged confident smiles as steaming cups of coffee filled the room with a rich aroma. Victor entered carrying the same leather briefcase Emily had returned only hours before. For the first time since recovering it, he allowed himself to believe the crisis had passed. He greeted everyone with practiced confidence before taking his seat at the head of the table. Across from him sat his longtime business partner, Charles Whitmore, a man whose calm smile had earned Victor's complete trust over nearly 15 years. As discussions began, printed reports circulated around the table while presentation screens displayed financial projections for Maple Grove's newest luxury development. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Every number seemed to support another successful expansion. Yet beneath the polished surface, something invisible had already begun shifting. While assistants distributed revised contracts, Victor noticed several figures that looked strangely different from the versions he remembered reviewing only 2 days earlier. At first, he assumed they were minor accounting adjustments. He continued listening as Charles confidently explained projected returns and recommended immediate approval before market conditions changed. The other investors nodded in agreement. One attorney quietly asked whether every amendment had been independently verified. Charles answered before anyone else could speak. "Everything has already been reviewed." His response sounded smooth, almost rehearsed. Victor studied the documents again, feeling a faint sense of uneasiness settle into his thoughts. Several property values seemed unusually inflated, while maintenance costs had nearly disappeared from the reports altogether. He frowned but remained silent. At nearly the same time, back at Maple Grove Apartments, Emily finished her morning shift at the neighborhood grocery store before stopping by the community bulletin board outside the leasing office. A stack of discarded papers had been left inside a recycling container after employees emptied yesterday's meeting folders. As a gust of wind scattered several pages across the sidewalk, Emily instinctively bent down to gather them before they blew into the street. Most were ordinary copies scheduled for disposal, but one page caught her attention because she recognized the company letterhead from the briefcase she had returned. The page listed maintenance inspections for multiple apartment buildings, including Maple Grove. Several inspection dates had been altered by hand, while approval signatures appeared noticeably inconsistent. Emily was not a lawyer or an accountant, but years of carefully organizing medical records and financial paperwork for her mother had taught her to notice details others overlooked. She compared 2 signatures printed on the same page and quietly realized they did not match. A maintenance supervisor walking past noticed the document in her hands and stopped abruptly. His expression changed the instant he saw the altered paperwork. "Where did you find that?" he asked in a hushed voice. Emily pointed toward the recycling container. The supervisor swallowed hard before looking toward the leasing office. That document was supposed to be destroyed yesterday. Emily looked back down at the page as another cool breeze stirred the remaining papers around her feet. She had no idea how those records connected to Victor's meeting downtown, but deep inside she sensed that what appeared to be forgotten paperwork might become far more valuable than anyone yet realized. The maintenance supervisor glanced around the courtyard before carefully folding the document and lowering his voice. "Miss Carter, this page should never have been left outside." Emily looked at him with quiet curiosity rather than suspicion. "Is something wrong with it?" The older man hesitated. He had worked at Maple Grove for nearly 20 years and had witnessed owners, managers, and investors come and go, but he had rarely questioned orders. Today felt different. Those inspection reports determine whether certain buildings qualify for financing and insurance approvals, he explained. If those signatures are not genuine, someone has a very serious problem. Emily looked down once more at the page, noticing details she had overlooked before. Dates had been rewritten in darker ink. Several apartment numbers were listed twice, while others were missing completely. Even without professional experience, the inconsistencies were difficult to ignore. "Should I bring this to the leasing office?" she asked. The supervisor sighed deeply. "Normally I would say yes, but if someone intentionally threw it away, there is no guarantee it reaches the right hands." His words lingered in Emily's thoughts long after he quietly walked away. She folded the paper neatly and slipped it into a plain manila folder before heading toward the city bus stop for her afternoon shift at the public library. Throughout the ride downtown, she tried convincing herself that the document was none of her concern. Victor Harrington had embarrassed her in front of the entire apartment complex less than 24 hours earlier. Most people would have walked away without another thought. Some might have considered it justice if his business suffered. Emily stared through the bus window as neighborhoods passed one after another beneath the pale autumn sky. Her mother had often repeated this same lesson throughout her childhood. Your choices say more about you than someone else's treatment of you. Those words echoed quietly inside her mind until they became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, inside the downtown conference room, the atmosphere had shifted from confidence to growing uncertainty. One investor questioned why inspection certifications supporting several $1 million in financing had been approved unusually fast. Another requested original records instead of photocopies. Charles Whitmore answered every concern with polished confidence, but Victor noticed tiny cracks beginning to appear beneath his partner's calm demeanor. For the first time in years, Charles avoided direct eye contact. The attorneys requested a brief recess while additional records were retrieved from company headquarters. Victor stepped toward the windows overlooking the city skyline, feeling an uneasiness he could not explain. Something was wrong. He simply did not know what. At the library, Emily finished organizing returned books before quietly asking permission to leave 30 minutes early. She carried the manila folder back toward Maple Grove, her decision becoming clearer with every step. She would deliver the document directly to Victor himself. Not because he deserved another favor, but because allowing dishonesty to grow would eventually hurt hundreds of families who depended upon safe homes and honest management. As the afternoon sun slipped behind the buildings, Emily reached the leasing office only to learn that Victor was still downtown. She left a brief handwritten message asking him to contact her as soon as possible regarding an important company record. The receptionist accepted the note without much interest, placing it beneath several other papers on the desk. Emily quietly thanked her and walked away, unaware that Charles Whitmore had already instructed someone inside headquarters to make certain that any unexpected messages concerning missing inspection documents never reached Victor Harrington's eyes. Late that afternoon, the conference room no longer carried the confidence that had filled it only hours before. Conversations had become guarded, and every unanswered question seemed to make the silence heavier. The legal team requested additional supporting files while investors quietly exchanged uncertain looks across the polished table. Victor Harrington maintained his composed expression, but years of experience had taught him that successful negotiations rarely slowed without a reason. Somewhere beneath the neatly organized reports, something was no longer adding up. At Maple Grove Apartments, Emily returned home believing she had done everything she reasonably could. She checked on her mother, prepared dinner, and attempted to push the growing concern from her mind. Yet every time she remembered the altered signatures on the inspection document, the same uneasy feeling returned. As evening settled across the apartment complex, she looked through her kitchen window toward the leasing office and made a decision. Waiting for someone else to act no longer felt right. She picked up the manila folder and walked outside once again. The leasing office was nearly empty when she arrived. Only the evening receptionist remained behind the front desk, sorting paperwork before closing. Emily politely asked whether Victor had returned. The receptionist shook her head. He is still downtown. They said the meeting is taking much longer than expected. Emily hesitated before carefully placing the folder on the counter. Please make sure only Mr. Harrington receives this. It may be important. Before the receptionist could respond, another voice interrupted from the hallway. Charles Whitmore stepped into the lobby with an easy smile that seemed perfectly friendly. He had returned briefly to collect several additional files before heading back to the meeting. Victor is extremely busy right now, he said smoothly. If this concerns company paperwork, I can deliver it personally. Emily looked at him for a moment. She recognized him from photographs displayed in the leasing office as Victor's longtime business partner. Everything about him appeared professional and trustworthy. Even so, something about the conversation made her pause. I would rather give it directly to Mr. Harrington, she answered respectfully. Charles smiled again, although this time the warmth barely reached his eyes. That will not be possible today. I assure you, anything you tell me reaches him immediately. Emily lowered her eyes toward the folder in her hands. She remembered the maintenance supervisor's warning and quietly tightened her grip. Thank you, she replied gently, but I promised myself I would place it only in his hands. For the briefest moment, Charles's pleasant expression disappeared. It was almost too quick to notice, but Emily caught the flash of irritation before his smile returned. Very well, he said calmly. I am sure. You know what is best. He walked past her toward the records room without another word. Emily left the office carrying the folder exactly as she had arrived. From the second-floor balcony, the maintenance supervisor watched the exchange unfold and slowly removed his cap. He had seen enough to understand that Emily's instincts had protected something far more important than a single document. Across town, Victor's cellular phone vibrated quietly beside his untouched cup of coffee. Buried beneath dozens of business notifications sat one missed message from the leasing office requesting that he contact Emily Carter immediately. He never saw it because, at that exact moment, Charles Whitmore calmly reached across the conference table and slid one final contract toward him, hoping Victor would sign away everything before the truth had the chance to catch up. The conference room had grown unnaturally quiet as the final contract rested in front of Victor Harrington. Every executive at the table sensed that the meeting had reached its decisive moment. Charles Whitmore leaned back with practiced confidence, his hands folded neatly as though the outcome had already been decided. Everything is ready, he said smoothly. Once you sign, construction begins next week. Victor reached for his pen but stopped halfway. Something continued bothering him. The financial projections, the inconsistent inspection dates, the unusual urgency, none of it felt like the careful process that had built his company over 3 decades. One of the outside attorneys cleared his throat before speaking. Before we proceed, I would like to verify one final compliance file. Charles answered almost immediately. That will only delay everyone unnecessarily. The attorney remained calm. Good business has never been harmed by careful verification. The room fell silent once again. At that very moment, Victor's assistant quietly entered the conference room carrying a small stack of documents that had just arrived from headquarters. She leaned toward Victor and whispered, "Sir, there is also a message from your leasing office. A tenant named Emily Carter has been trying to reach you about an important company record." Victor looked up instantly. Emily Carter. The name immediately brought back yesterday's forgotten briefcase and the quiet young woman who had returned it without expecting anything in return. Before he could ask another question, Charles spoke with an easy laugh. I already handled that. It was probably another misunderstanding from the property office. Victor slowly turned toward him. Handled what? Charles smiled without hesitation. Nothing important. I simply did not want small apartment issues interrupting a meeting involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Victor stared at him for several seconds. Yesterday, Emily had protected documents that could have disappeared forever. She had refused to open a briefcase filled with opportunities that could have changed her own difficult life. Suddenly, the contrast between her quiet honesty and Charles's eagerness became impossible to ignore. Bring me every message she left, Victor said firmly to his assistant. Charles shifted in his chair. Victor, we are wasting valuable time. Perhaps, Victor replied, or perhaps we have already wasted too much by ignoring the wrong person. Within minutes, the assistant returned carrying the handwritten note Emily had left at the leasing office along with a scanned copy of the inspection page she had insisted on delivering personally. The attorney accepted the document and immediately compared the signatures with the contracts lying on the conference table. His expression changed almost instantly. Another attorney leaned closer before quietly shaking his head. These signatures are inconsistent. A third legal advisor opened additional digital records on a laptop and found even more discrepancies. The atmosphere inside the conference room transformed completely. Chairs stopped moving. Coffee cups remained untouched. No one spoke for several long seconds. Charles's calm confidence slowly disappeared as questions began arriving from every direction. Investors demanded explanations. Auditors requested original records. The financing representatives suspended the approval process pending a full review. Victor looked across the table at the man he had trusted for nearly 15 years, then lowered his eyes toward Emily's handwritten note resting beside the altered documents. The room had become so silent that even the gentle hum of the heating system sounded unusually loud. In that silence, Victor finally understood a truth he should have recognized the day before. The poorest person in his apartment community had just become the only person whose honesty could save everything he had spent a lifetime building. Less than 1 hour later, Victor Harrington's black sport utility vehicle rolled through the entrance of Maple Grove Apartments with none of the confidence it had carried the previous afternoon. The same courtyard that had witnessed Emily's public humiliation now stood wrapped in the quiet glow of early evening as residents returned home from work. Victor stepped out slowly, holding Emily's handwritten note in one hand while the copied inspection document rested inside a slim folder beneath his arm. He looked around the familiar buildings differently now. For years, he had measured the value of his property in square feet, occupancy rates, and investment returns. Today, he found himself wondering how he had completely failed to measure the character of the people who live there. He walked directly toward Building C, where the maintenance supervisor quietly pointed him toward Emily's apartment. Victor paused outside the modest door for several seconds before knocking gently. Emily opened the door wearing the same gray sweater she had worn the day before. She seemed surprised to see him standing there, but her expression remained calm. Mr. Harrington, she said politely. May I come in for a moment? He asked. Emily stepped aside without hesitation. The apartment felt warm and peaceful. The scent of homemade vegetable soup filled the air while soft piano music played quietly from an old radio in the corner. Victor noticed family photographs, neatly organized books, and carefully repaired furniture. Nothing inside reflected wealth, yet everything reflected dignity. Emily invited him to sit at the small kitchen table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victor finally placed the folder on the table between them. Your document stopped me from making the biggest mistake of my career, he admitted quietly. Emily looked down at the folder before gently folding her hands together. I was only worried something was not right. Victor nodded slowly. You were right. The signatures had been altered. The financing has been suspended while investigators review every record. He hesitated before continuing. If you had stayed silent, I would have signed those contracts today. Emily simply listened. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, no trace of revenge, only quiet compassion. Victor looked directly at her. "After the way I treated you yesterday, most people would have walked away." Emily answered with the same calm honesty that had guided every decision she had made. "Someone else's choices should not decide mine." The words settled over the room with remarkable simplicity. Victor lowered his head. For perhaps the first time in many years, he found no excuse strong enough to defend his own behavior. "I judged you without knowing anything about your life," he said softly. "I saw financial hardship and assumed it reflected your character. I was completely wrong." Emily offered a small, understanding smile. "We all have moments we wish we could do differently." Victor looked at her with quiet disbelief. She had every reason to remind him of his public insults, yet she offered him grace instead. The silence inside the apartment became unexpectedly peaceful. Outside, the evening sunlight reflected softly across the windows of Maple Grove, while inside that modest kitchen, a man who had spent his life believing success came from power finally realized that the strongest foundation any person could build was simple integrity, and it belonged to the young woman he had once believed had nothing of value to offer. 3 days later, the residents of Maple Grove Apartments gathered in the courtyard after receiving an unexpected notice inviting everyone to a community meeting. Curiosity filled the cool evening air as neighbors stood beneath the golden leaves that drifted gently from the tall maple trees surrounding the property. Employees from the leasing office lined the walkway with unusually serious expressions while Victor Harrington stood alone near the entrance, no longer dressed to impress, but wearing a simple navy jacket that reflected none of the authority he had once displayed so proudly. Emily arrived quietly after finishing work at the library, hoping only to listen before returning home to her mother. She never expected every pair of eyes to turn toward her the moment Victor stepped forward. The courtyard grew completely silent. Victor took a slow breath before speaking. "A few days ago, I stood here and judged someone without knowing her story. I embarrassed a person whose character proved greater than my own." His voice carried across the courtyard with a sincerity no one had heard before. He turned toward Emily. "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology, not only in private, but before every person who witnessed my behavior." Emily looked genuinely surprised. Victor continued, "You returned property that could have disappeared forever. You tried to warn me when something was wrong. You protected my company even after I gave you every reason to walk away. Because of your honesty, fraudulent documents were discovered before irreversible damage was done. Several internal investigations are now underway, and changes are being made to ensure this never happens again." The residents exchanged quiet glances as they absorbed every word. Victor lowered his head slightly. "I believe success meant recognizing valuable assets. The greatest asset in this community was standing in front of me all along, and I nearly overlooked it because I judged appearances instead of character." No one spoke. Even the children playing nearby seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Victor reached into a folder and removed several papers. "Effective immediately, your lease has been fully renewed at the same rate for the next 5 years, and every late fee previously charged has been permanently removed." Emily looked at the documents, but gently shook her head. "That is generous, but I did not help because I expected anything in return." Victor smiled faintly. "I know. That is exactly why you deserve kindness." Emily accepted the papers with quiet gratitude, understanding that this gesture was not payment for honesty, but evidence that a proud man had finally learned humility. Around them, applause began softly before spreading throughout the courtyard. The maintenance supervisor smiled beneath his weathered cap, while neighbors who had witnessed the public humiliation only days earlier now watched dignity quietly restored. As the gathering slowly dispersed, Victor remained standing for a moment, looking across the apartment community with entirely different eyes. Buildings were no longer just investments. They were homes filled with people whose worth could never be measured by income, clothing, or circumstance. Emily walked back toward her apartment beneath the fading evening light, carrying nothing more than the same quiet grace she had always possessed. She had not changed because the world finally noticed her. The world had changed because one ordinary woman refused to let someone else's cruelty determine the kind of person she would become. And on that peaceful evening, everyone who had witnessed both moments remembered a truth far more valuable than money. Respect is never earned by power. It is earned by the quiet choices made when no one is watching.